Between 1932 and 1972, the United States government conducted the Tuskegee Syphilis Study. Public health officials deliberately withheld treatment from Black men, choosing to study the disease's progression instead of curing it. The subjects were never told the truth about their condition. When the details finally broke, survivors sued the government under the Federal Tort Claims Act. Facing immense public pressure, the government settled the claims for $10 million in 1974. But that settlement meant the case never reached a judge, and no court ever formally ruled that the government's actions were illegal. Congress responded to that missing judicial precedent by writing a legislative substitute. They created 45 CFR Part 46, a strict set of federal regulations governing the protection of human subjects. These rules forged a permanent legal boundary. They mandated that federal health agencies could never again administer a medical intervention without providing total, meaningful disclosure to the patient. That boundary was tested during the Gulf War. The Department of Defense ordered military personnel to receive investigational anthrax and botulism toxoid vaccines, entirely bypassing informed consent. Congress intervened again. To prevent future medical overreach, lawmakers constructed the Emergency Use Authorization, or EUA, framework. The EUA statute contains a precise legal mechanism. It allows the government to distribute investigational medical products during a crisis, but it explicitly guarantees civilians the statutory right to refuse those specific products. Together, the strict disclosure rules of Part 46 and the explicit right to refuse under an EUA formed a two-part legal shield. The Department of Health and Human Services was the exact agency entrusted by Congress to enforce it. In 2021, Stephen Bennett worked as a senior management analyst for the Federal Reserve Board of Governors. Bennett was an active cancer patient, and his job was to analyze complex data sets to identify material discrepancies. When the Federal Reserve announced its COVID-19 vaccine mandate, Bennett analyzed the regulatory record and found a glaring legal signal. The specific Pfizer vaccine being mandated and administered held an emergency use authorization. Under federal law, this EUA label was highly specific. Because the vaccine had not completed the full clinical trial process required for licensure, it was legally defined as investigational. This meant Bennett and the rest of the public retained their statutory right to decline it. However, HHS and the CDC were issuing public guidance claiming the mandated vaccines were fully FDA approved. They were conflating the available EUA product with a fully licensed biologic called Comirnaty. But the fully approved Comirnaty was not actually available for administration in the United States. By blurring these legally distinct categories, federal health agencies bypassed the statutory requirements. Presenting an investigational vaccine as fully approved systematically dismantled the public's legal right to say no. Bennett submitted a medical exemption request based on 3 documented realities: a written recommendation from his oncologist to avoid the vaccine during active treatment, peer-reviewed data showing diminished mRNA efficacy in cancer patients, and the accurate legal distinction of the EUA. The Federal Reserve dismissed all 3 points. Instead of exercising independent medical judgment or reviewing his correct legal analysis, the board overrode his exemption by copy-pasting the factually flawed HHS public guidance. The board gave Bennett an impossible ultimatum. He had to accept an investigational medical product against his primary physician's specific recommendation, or he would be fired and lose the health insurance that was funding his ongoing cancer care. This regulatory misdirection was shielded by a coordinated digital environment. This animated visualization charts the sequential JIRA ticket numbers subpoenaed from the government's Virality Project, an operation that monitored online vaccine discussions. Bennett's analysis of the data revealed that a massive 85% of the sequential ticket record was entirely missing from the congressional production. Bennett was terminated. His firing demonstrates how government misrepresentation, paired with the active suppression of corrective facts, functioned as an engineered trap for federal employees honoring their oath. Bennett fought back by filing a landmark lawsuit against the United States under the Federal Tort Claims Act. He argued that HHS engaged in negligent misrepresentation that directly caused his termination. The government's defense strategy relies heavily on sovereign immunity. They argue that HHS is protected by the discretionary function exception, effectively claiming their public guidance is a shielded policy choice. The informed consent framework leaves no room for this defense. Statutes simply do not grant federal employees the discretion to disseminate factually inaccurate medical information regarding the regulatory status of an investigational drug. The agency, originally created to protect citizens from uninformed medical experimentation, is now using procedural immunity to avoid answering for violating the very regulations it exists to enforce. Currently, Bennett's lawsuit is trapped in procedural dismissals. To date, no court has reviewed the merits of the case to determine whether HHS's conduct was actually lawful. If this record stands, federal agencies can lie about investigational drugs during the next emergency and face zero legal consequences. This lawsuit represents a final stand to close that accountability gap. It demands that the government remains legally bound to tell citizens the exact truth about what goes into their bodies before the next crisis arrives.